Chapter 55. Alden had heard that some humans could run hundreds of miles without sleep. Not even avowed. Just ordinary humans. Not that ordinary, he thought as he jogged. Ultra-marathoners. Trained, awesome people. He was not trained. Or awesome. And he was carrying another person on his back. But if being an avowed was ever going to count for something, he wanted it to count for this. He hit Azure Rabbit. He had a whole lot of ground for it to work with. It wasn't that he thought he could travel across country without rest for days, but that he needed to. Depending on when Kibby had stopped the car, depending on how fast his average speed was, the trip could be 2 days. Or 4. Or more. Maybe there were 300 miles left to go. Maybe there were twice that many. Alden hadn't asked Kibby for the number before he started carrying her because it didn't matter. They were in it now. He would run, walk, or crawl them out of it. Or they would both die. In a way, the clarity of his options was a gift. There was no longer any point in second-guessing the decisions that had led them here. Alden was sure he'd made stupid mistakes. Probably a lot of them. He was ignorant and incompetent in too many ways. But he'd done his best, and now all the choices had been exhausted. He didn't even have a compass. He just traveled in what he hoped was a straight line away from the car, even though he knew it probably wasn't. He tried to aim for large holes or ditches he could make out in the distance directly in front of him. It was the best he could do for landmarks. At least his target, the non-chaos zone, was massive. As long as he didn't get delirious and start walking in completely the wrong direction, he wasn't likely to miss. He ran sometimes. He walked others. He wished he had music to drown out the drum of his own heart in his ears. When he got thirsty, he planted a sprinkler deep in the ground and sealed a plastic bag over its head to catch some of the water. "Thanks, then he whispered as he paced around the device. He couldn't stop moving. Maybe Kibby could still withstand the corrupted environment for a long while. Or maybe it was only minutes. He didn't think she knew any better than he did. It took a while for the sprinkler to produce a decent amount for a drink, but it was better than trying to carry jugs of water on top of everything else. He ate some dried fruit while he waited. When he'd drunk his fill, he picked up his sprinkler and kept going. Line of asterisks. Hours later, more than half a day of Alden's time sense wasn't totally wrong, he realized something bizarre was going on with the ground. It might have been going on for a long time. The convenient way his trait interacted with the soil while he was in motion meant he felt like he was kicking off of something solid even when it was just a thin crust of dirt or it was loose and sandy. So he didn't notice what was happening beneath his feet by feeling it. Instead, he saw the whole landscape do something. The change was so subtle it would have been hard to notice except for the fact that the view on Munthagund was monotonous. Before it was grass. Now it was ditches and potholes. And here. Did the dirt just move? All of it. Because there was no wind, Alden was not accustomed to seeing motion of any kind around him. He slowed down to his slowest walk. Several minutes later, it happened again. Everywhere he looked, in the same instant, the loosest patches of soil shifted. Then, they settled back to stillness. "I think it's been less than a day. I'm really tired, but I can't be hallucinating yet." It happened a few more times, and Alden finally stopped working altogether and just took single steps from side to side to keep the skill active on Kibby. There was a shallow depression in the ground in front of him. A patch with sandy crumbling edges. He stared at it intently, and a couple of minutes later, the grains of dark sand shivered in place. A small chunk of the edge collapsed into the depression with the quiet hiss of falling grains. Then, everything was still again. "Okay," Alden said to himself. What was that? He kept walking and watching, trying to come up with theories. The only one that made sense was that the whole ground was moving. Like an earthquake. If an earthquake happened for the briefest of moments at perfectly regular intervals. Assuming it wasn't a giant subterranean demon creature's heartbeat, thanks for coming up with that thought, brain. His next, more hopeful guess was that it might have something to do with the wizards cleaning up the chaos. It's like something is banging on Munthagund like a drum. On the one hand, that would be good news. Being close enough to feel the effects meant he hadn't turned in a giant semicircle and started heading back to the lab on the other. What if they weren't doing some high-powered cleansing spell to get rid of the chaos like he and Kibby had both assumed? What if it was more like they were dropping magical nukes on it from space? He was hoping to walk into a clean zone surrounded by benevolent chanting wizards. Not step out of the chaos into a giant bombing range. Alden thought that most of the things that would make a planet-sized moon tremble would make a human-sized person dead. But that changes nothing, he decided. Because I can't turn back. One foot in front of the other. For as long as he could naturally. And after that, he still had a couple of tricks in his pocket. Line of asterisks. When I get home, I'm going to be lazy. Alden made his decision. Sometime. How long had it been? A full 24 hours yet? Longer? Was that only wishful thinking? One of the sprinklers had given up. He'd gotten water out of it 5 times. Farm had earned his business if they ever actually grew something that wasn't mildly toxic for humans. I'm going to be one of those lazy, rich rabbits that everyone envies and hates. No, even worse than those rabbits. I'm going to be the laziest one that ever existed. He would never walk another step. He would buy a car. And a driver. He would hire servants to carry him on a palanquin. He'd pay some adjuster with the right spell to follow him around and levitate him up staircases. Everything hurt. Legs. Back. Feet. Shoulders. Authority. He kept adjusting the straps that held Kibby in place, trying to relieve pressure. They'd started to rub him raw even through the coat and the layers of clothes. Focusing on his future life as the human embodiment of sloth helped for a while. When that stopped working, he tried to hold a mental conversation with the gremlin. You were loud about the big chain debt for a while, and then you got quiet, he said. I don't mind if you want to be loud again. It stayed silent. That's really scary of you. Hey. Gorgon's confused ancestors. Talk to me. Keep me company at least. He waited for a reply that never came. Fine. Be that way. When I get home, I'm going to hire an S-ranked sway to force us to eat an entire rack of barbecued ribs. He snorted at the image of himself, trying to explain to some disturbed sway why it would be a necessary and righteous use of their powers. From far away, there was a single whoomph of sound. Staring down at the taped-up toes of his sneakers, Alden saw the ground shake. They started back. The distant hammering of something against the moon had gone on for a long time. Then it had stopped for a long time. And now here it was again. With sound effects. We're still moving the right way. He coaxed a few more steps out of himself with that knowledge. But it was getting way too hard. He thought his left foot might be bleeding inside his shoe. I guess I should do something about that. It's still a long way. No matter what, it's still a really long way. The supply pack around his waist contained bandages, numbing spray, and a change of socks. He was just scared to stop and drop the preservation on Kibby for the minute or two it would take him to use it. He was afraid she'd be hurt. He was afraid he wouldn't be able to pick her back up. Physically or magically. Whumph. It wasn't like the situation was going to get better as time passed, though. He walked a bit farther, trying to put himself in the right headspace to do and say the right things. What were the right things again? Whumph. They came around 10 minutes apart maybe. That was cool. He could use the sound of the Artonans bombing the hell out of his destination to keep time. Whumph. Alden took a knee in the soft dirt. It hurt. His knees were starting to hurt. They'd never done that before. Was it just the amount of walking and running, or was the trait taking a toll on his joints? Alden. Don't unstrap yourself, he said. He was surprised at how dry and raspy his voice sounded. He'd been drinking plenty. I'm just changing my socks really quick, and then we're moving again. Can you do just a couple of minutes? I'm fine. No lies right now. We're making good time. Ha! Hypocrite. You don't even know if you're lying yourself or not. I'm fine, Kibby whispered. Alden's feet looked way worse than they'd felt. One of his heels was actually glued to his socks with blood and whatever the clear stuff that came out of blisters was. He lifted the foot, hunched over so that he could reach his hands around it. Made an attempt at the kindergarten hand sanitizing spell. If you held something in a specific position between your hands, it was supposed to work on it instead of them. So maybe it would help. His authority shuddered. Straining it in a new direction made him feel how far from himself, Artonan inversion of the word, he was. He sprayed the numbing spray. Bandaged the foot. Pulled on the clean sock. Stuffed it in the shoe. How long has it been? Kibby asked, wriggling a little against his back. She knew he didn't really know. Almost 3 days, he lied again. You know that means we must be getting close. Whumph. What's that? Alden finished doing the best he could and stood back up. That's where we're headed. His whole body screamed at him when he tried to take a step forward. He almost fell face first in the dirt. He tried again with almost the same result. He wanted to lay down. He wanted to sleep right here in the chaos. It couldn't be that bad, could it? Oh, he thought. So this is how far I go without cheating. Hey, Gremlin. I know you're not gone even if you pretend to be. When I see something cool. Alden licked his lips and cleared his throat. Then, he said the sacrifice hat for the peace of mind chain. He shuddered as it fell on him. His anxiety spiked. His sluggish, sleepy thoughts turned a little wilder. I can't stop moving. I can't. I'll die. He took a step and then another. It wasn't enough to satisfy his fresh sense of dread. He needed to jog. So he did. The opposite of peace of mind was fear. Occasionally, fear was a good thing. Line of asterisks. Blowback for peace of mind lasted around 3 hours. Alden made the sacrifice 3 times, paying back the debt for every chain he'd used to sleep in the car. Then, because he hadn't physically fallen down yet and his body was still functioning, if poorly and painfully, he used it a 4th. He was going to enjoy having the positive half in the bank at some point. By the time the 4th started to run out, he was staggering more than he was walking. Everything hurt so freaking much that even the fear couldn't keep him moving anymore. He tried to focus on the Oriat. Kibby's gift was a constant source of comfort, hidden under his shirt against his chest. It was the only thing in the world that felt pleasant anymore. His body was done. His authority wasn't recovering. At all. All the new authority he had might still existed. But it had been pushed too far out of alignment. Or something like that. It was tired. He was tired. He couldn't thrust the chaos away. He felt like something was penetrating right through the rest of him to batter at his skill and the trait that was built onto it. Now, it seemed like even that was at risk of cracking apart. Alden kept urging it along. Kept his fingers deliberately pressed against all of the machines on buttons, so to speak. But it was getting hard. He wondered if it would have been better or worse if he couldn't actually feel the machine. He could see it going either way. Maybe an avowed who wasn't able to feel the skill consciously wouldn't be able to keep forcing it to work in this situation. Or, maybe they would, and they wouldn't even know they were in this unique kind of pain. Alden had never been in pain before, when he felt the thing most humans called skill drain. It just kind of stopped. The skill is stronger than it was, though. A lot stronger. He remembered months and months ago, how that single fleck of a demon grasshopper had landed on Kibby's hair and made him reel. He knew it was a direct strike against the skill from a creature that actually magnified chaos. But he thought he could take it much more easily now. He was positive that the skill could not have preserved another person for days before. And now it could. It could do it even here, in this hostile place, where Alden was falling apart. At least level 4, he thought. If it's not at least there by now, I'm going to have a fight with the system about its abilities as a judge. He stepped wrong. His ankle rolled. It had happened before, but this time it was bad enough that he was pulled for a moment from his focus on the skill and the assault of the chaos back into his beleaguered body. Without his attention, his trait collapsed. It just turned itself off without his permission. Even though he was still carrying Kibby. His feet sank and inched into soft dirt. Yeah. This is worse than bad, he thought tersely, kicking up soil and sand as he trudged forward. Gotta keep the willpower and the focus up somehow. Abusing my adrenal glands with reverse peace of mind isn't going to cut it from here on it. He was so tired his vision was tunneling. He planted his last sprinkler. It hadn't worked well for its past 2 uses, and it didn't for this one either. It just dribbled water down its plastic sides, and he had to wait a long time for his bag to catch enough to make a decent amount for drinking. This time it didn't. He got a measly cup before it quit for good. Alden gulped it down, saving the last sip in his mouth while he fumbled with fingers that had once been kind of dexterous for the very last of his last resorts. He pulled out a small silver pill bottle and poured the contents into his palm. This one keeps you from throwing up. This one keeps you from passing out. This one temporarily inoculates you against the tet fever, and this last one makes you unable to register physical pain. He still remembered them all. He ditched the tet fever. Kibby said it didn't even exist on Munthagund, so he needed it. He tossed the other 3 into his mouth and swallowed them with the last of his water. It took less than a minute for the effects to kick in. Just as he'd remembered from his trip to the hospital with Stuart, the Artonans were great at drugging people. His vision untunneled. He could straighten his spine without the agony of a couple of different pulled muscles. He could put his full weight on the ankle he was pretty sure he'd just sprained. He felt normal. Physically. If he didn't have common sense and authority sense, he would have thought they'd given him a healing miracle in a bottle. But he did have authority sense, so even though he felt great in one way, he felt like crap in another. He took a few steps forward easily, trying to get Azure Rabbit back online. Come on, he thought, pushing at the part of his bound authority that belonged to the trait. You only do one trick, so you'd better do it. It was going to be a really slow walk without it. Maybe pushing isn't the right thing, he thought. Maybe it's more. He tried to picture the way the trait was designed. The thing the system had built for Alden to use. He had been poking at it angrily for ages now, resenting it even as he knew he needed it. So he knew what had gone wrong when he took a closer look at it. It wasn't just turned off. It was slightly askew. This wasn't something perception or positive thinking was going to fix. The trait itself had weakened and wobbled. It didn't want to recover. And now that Alden examined it with his mind free of the burden of a host of bodily aches and pains, it was a big crack in his overall stability, and that crack was deepening. Not good. There's got to be a way to mold my authority back into the proper shape of the trait. Like manipulating it to fill in the empty panes when I make patterns with the Oriad. I know I can't alter the trait, but trying to patch what's already here by asserting its existence deliberately should be doable, right? Like. He took another step, and his foot finally left the ground in the way he wanted it to. Ha! He said in a rasping voice as he jogged forward. Alden can do magic intelligently now. He's an avowed with Kinder Wizard training. Admittedly, he was also hyped up on alien drugs and talking about himself in the third person. But it was still an impressive achievement. Line of asterisks. The good-bad thing about feeling a little better was that Alden actually had enough presence of mind to think again. He could imagine clearly all the terrible things that lay ahead. The worst, by far, was the thought of what would happen when he collapsed. He was sure that when the drugs gave out, he finally would, too. Permanently. Kibby would have to see that. He didn't want it for her. But there was nothing more he could do to prevent it from happening. Since running didn't hurt anymore, he was running. The whumph, whumph sounds came again. So much louder. He could see the ground shake clearly now. Soil jumped around him every time. In the distance, on the edge of the horizon, the sky looked strange. Far too dark. Like an approaching storm on a moon that never had them. Hours passed. The sounds stopped. The storm clouds grew closer. Alden let his body move as if it wasn't being destroyed and focused all his attention on asserting his trait and his skill. Not even the rest of himself anymore. He'd had to stop. He'd had to choose. So he chose just those two things. They seemed like something the system had taken from Alden and written onto reality. They chained him. He'd never be rid of them. But if they were the only thing holding him here now, he'd rely on them. They kept wobbling and cracking, and he kept reasserting them. Who has language for existing harder? Me. Now. Apparently. A lot can change in a little while, I guess. He could feel his heart racing like it wanted to escape from his body. He could feel himself gasping like his lungs were begging him for air. Under his coat, his clothes were drenched, and he wasn't sure if it was sweat or blood. But none of it hurt. And he thought, maybe, that storm was his destination. So he didn't stop. Chapter 56. As always since coming to Monthagund, Alice woke feeling peace and tranquility. She slid from beneath the heated blankets of her bed and threw on a silk robe, her uniform for the day. Here, there was nobody around who would whisper behind their hands and wonder what it meant for the future of the true planets that she had dared to stay in her pajamas for work. Indicorous bliss, she thought, humming to herself as she brushed her dark lavender hair and read the messages scrolling across her mirror with one brown eye. They arrived from Artona with a delay of almost an hour, reminding her of just how delightfully far out of reach she was at the moment. The original plan was for her to be at home right now, doing all the things a nurturing mother should do with a healthy set of newborn wizard triplets. Nursing them, racing to their cribs at their every cry, coddling their tiny authority senses to be sure they were developing properly. Diapers. Thank goodness this corruption mishap had occurred just a week before she was scheduled to give birth. She'd waddled herself straight into the Grand Senate's emergency session and volunteered for duty. With enthusiasm that at least a few senators seemed to have mistaken for hostility. But the point was that she was off the hook. And this was the easiest assignment she had taken in decades. They didn't like to have the quaternary at a post like this. Too long-term and low import. Yet here she was, months away from the political morass, family drama, and the immense stress that came from trying to like your own babies. It was just so hard when they were in that frightening needy stage. They couldn't even talk to her yet, and she was always scared she might accidentally smoosh them with her authority in a fit of postpartum confusion. Some of the spouses in the household adored newborns. It was best to leave the triplets to them. Alice would take a vacation from work and fall in love with the little creatures when they were old enough to toddle around and make comprehensible sounds. 3, she thought, gliding out of her suite and entering the Travel Dome's dining room. I'd like to get to know them when they're around 3. First meal was a beautiful spread of breads, jams, and smoked meats. No nasty military rations on this trip. There had been time to fully outfit the ship with everything she could possibly need, and if she wanted something beyond that, they could just zip right over to the other side of the moon and fetch it. You're awake early, night Alice said Roro from the opposite end of the dining table. Greetings on the new day. I am honored to be in your presence. No need to rise. Alice said quickly. But not quickly enough. Damn it. The Icorlax was already hovering respectfully over her chair, her rainbow-colored wings creating a small gust in the room. Roro was new to Alice's team of avowed helpers. She had secretly wanted to work with an Icorlax ever since she was a girl. Such an interesting people. Soft feather scales, 4-clawed feet, the colorful wings. And they were known to promote a sense of well-being in their companions. Great for camp building. But theirs was a rare species, and besides that, they didn't handle violence well. Emotionally. This had seemed like the perfect opportunity to invite one along for an easy, stress-free job and make a new acquaintance. Officially Roro was the team healer. Only nobody was going to need healing because why would they in a place like this? Alice was just supposed to have one with her at all times when she was on duty. Roro, I've told you. You don't have to be so formal anymore. We're going to be here for months cleaning up. You just perch back and help yourself to some of these nice candied lung fruits. I know you like them. It's another great day for crushing the chaos out of an ugly moon, and all you have to do is watch through the dome. She glanced up at the transparent roof of the travel dome. It was completely coated in a thick layer of dust so that she couldn't even see the gloomy sky overhead. Oops. She'd meant to cast a spell over it yesterday to ward off the clouds of falling dirt. The terraforming she was doing was messy. "I will clean the dome while you're away this morning, night Alice Art single quote. By the time you return for second meal, it will be pristine." "But Roro, I can do it in just a few moments with a spell." Maybe she'd been taking the wrong approach to relaxing the Icorlax. The voyage here had taken ages, and the Avowed still hadn't gotten any less stiff around Alice. She knew she was intimidating, but she wasn't that intimidating, surely. Roro had known how long the trip would be when she agreed to come along, so she shouldn't be mad about the assignment. Maybe she was one of those people who was more comfortable with a task, and the lack of work for a healer was only making her feel out of place. "Yes, thank you," Alice said. "Please clean off the dome. That will be a big help." She took her seat so that the Icorlax would stop hovering, and she smeared some bright green preserves on a piece of hot flatbread. The rest of the small ground team arrived as first meal progressed. There were 6 of them total living in the dome. 2 wizards besides Alice had come down to the corruption zone with the group. They were old friends. Understanding about the pajamas, she left the other Artonans in orbit or ordered them to aid the locals in the inconveniencing the cities that had been left without the services of a contract for so long. She'd have to rejoin them and start behaving appropriately once the corruption was repaired. The contract re-establishment phase of the operation was going to be a bother, but there was some satisfaction in knowing they'd finally be giving this place a proper, fully functioning one. It would enable even non-wizards to communicate and travel around the triplanets with ease. A vast improvement in their lives that had been far too long in coming. Alice smiled and bit into her breakfast. She still had a long time before she had to associate with everyone on the ship. For now, she could just relax with her preferred companions. In addition to the 3 Artonans and the Icorlax, there was an Avowed Lorch who had worked as a secretary for Alice before becoming too elderly to travel with her on her usual assignments. The pay for a trip of this length would set him up nicely for retirement. If Alice couldn't convince him to deviate from his species' customs and accept some rejuvenation treatments. Kraa, the Gryvik, clawed his way up to the table last. Alice could just tell by the backwards tilt of his helmet, which he didn't need after his last set of enhancements but had chosen to wear since it had an excellent non-system translator, that he was gazing at everyone judgmentally. "You know I could catch my own food if I wanted to," Alice said, looking up at the enormous Avowed as she added flaked fish to another piece of flatbread. On a planet that actually had animals tasty enough to be worth the endeavor. Traveling with Grivex was a riot, usually, and she and Kraa had been working together on and off for years. But he wasn't at all happy with the treats she'd had stabled on the spaceship especially for him. He claimed the small herd of Balkans were too domesticated to make good meals. Alice sighed. It had been hard to convince everyone that she needed to devote part of the ship to a bunch of angry alien livestock in the first place. And they'd almost eaten their handler twice. She was doing her best. It wasn't her fault that Munthagund lacked sufficiently entertaining food options for a Gryvik so powerful that the most satisfying prey would actually be his traveling companions. "I think the boredom is eroding my mind," greater than Kraa said in an eerie high shriek that was only partially modulated by the helmet's translation function. "A few hours ago, I thought I sensed prey." Greater than. "No eating demons," Alice said promptly. There was nothing else out here he could have been sensing. Even if some small fright comes this way, it's just not a good idea. Kill it or run it into the smash zone. "Can we fight each other after you're done battling Bert? I don't want my skills to dull." Greater than. Roro gasped in horror. Alice glanced at the healer. "What a suggestion, Kraa." "Of course not. My goodness. Violence is so violent. Perhaps this afternoon you and I should go for a peaceful walk together instead. Far, far away. A little friendly exercise of our legs." Kraa made the terrifying sound that was a Gryvik's laugh. "Yes. We will exercise our legs. And our claws. And our teeth." Greater than. I hope he doesn't actually expect me to use my teeth, Alice thought. The conversation turned to the plans for the day. People filled her in on what she had missed while she slept. Back home, someone was in a tizzy about that giant explosion a few days ago at Whirly Rodin's old facility. They wanted Alice to go and get proof that it had been an act of deliberate sabotage by the former owner. Something she had already decided not to do. She wasn't that invested in Rodin's situation, but her brother had looked mildly unhappy when he told her the man had been pulled from Thagund. So she would just wait a while before turning her attention to it. Let the corruption work on the site for a few more months so she could say that there was no way to be sure whether or not some angry scientist might have planted a bomb there before he was hauled off by the authorities. And how could anyone expect her to rush over for such a petty personal vendetta, when there was chaos to beat into submission? Creative beating was Alice Art's single quotations preferred method. Very stress-relieving. And she liked looking behind her to see the nice flat and fertile chaos for land she had left in her wake. One of the Artonans handed her a tablet, and she read over the notes they'd made on the area that was to be cleared today. Atmospheric readings, altitude and depth of the corruption zone, numbers that indicated a million tiny fractures in this patch of reality that she would be fixing by overriding it with a stronger version of her own making. She supposed to the untrained eye it must look like she was only lifting millions of fills of soil into the atmosphere and then slamming them back into the ground again for her own amusement. And, yes, that was what she was doing. But there was technique involved. It required extraordinary control and quite a lot of thought to operate on this scale. "It's not boring," she said to Kra as she stood up from the table. Everyone was bustling, making preparations to leave the dome. "I have to use both sides of my brain for it. I wish someone with great power would attack you." Greater than," said the Gryvik. "I do think I need a challenge. The presence is only getting stronger. Perhaps it is the Icorlax." Greater than. Roro let out a strangled squawk of horror. The healer had been about to step out the dome's hexagonal door with a bucket of cleaning supplies. Oh no. When she offered to clean, did she mean she was going to scrub it with her hands? I thought she must have some kind of spell impression that would help at least. Alice hadn't done exhaustive research into the Icorlax before they left Artona and the contract behind. She preferred to let Avowed show off their non-essential skills and spells when the need arose instead of digging into every single detail of their power set. It made for fun surprises when you were getting to know a new person. "Roro, it's just a joke. Kra would never slaughter a shipmate. It would be rude." The healer threw the door open wider and leaped back. A moment later, two people stepped in. Staggered in, Alice corrected herself, staring at the filthy pair in shock. People were not supposed to be alive within the corruption zone. No rescue orders had been issued. One of them was, she thought, a human male. Under all the sweat and blood and dirt. Though that didn't seem right or possible at all. Maybe he was a tall Artonan with unusual bone structure? He was wearing a long red coat that was partially melted and full of holes. His companion, a small girl, was also not right or possible in this context. One of her hands had a corruption wound, and the other, with a dark blue Oriad wrapped around it, was gripping as tightly. They both reeked. In the organic way and the chaotic one. The humanish person smiled faintly through cracked lips at the sight of the gathered wizards and Avowed and collapsed onto his knees. The girl never let go of his hand. Her eyes landed on Alice and widened. "Night Alice Art single quotation," she said in a loud, firm voice. "I am Kiv B, and this is Alden. We are friends of your brother. We politely request assistance." A small, colorful parrot person ripped Alden's shirts in half like they were made of tissue paper and shoved clawed hands covered in a fine layer of scales against his chest. A moment before, they had done the same thing to Kibby. He heard them saying things rapidly. It was Artonan, but he could barely understand any of it. Sound was strange. His vision was strange. It was like his senses were no longer properly connected to his brain. "We did it," he kept thinking as he lay on his back in the floor, staring up at the ceiling. He and Kibby had thought this place was made of dirt when they first approached, but it was just coated in the stuff. "We made it out." He had run through a cloud of dust particles that made it hard to breathe until he'd come to a short but enormously wide cliff in the landscape. It was 15 or so feet of sudden topographical difference in a smooth crescent shape that extended as far as his blurred vision could make out. Why had the Artonians dug out the soil? Or squashed it flatter? Alden didn't know. It didn't matter. The crescent was the bite someone had taken out of the Chaos Pizza. It had to be. On the other side, Kibby would be safe. There was no way to climb down, so he jumped. He landed badly and heard something snap. He wasn't sure if it was an ankle or a wrist or a muscle. He still couldn't feel pain. Probably the parrot person knows what it was. He thought he was supposed to know the name of their species, but he couldn't even make himself want to remember facts right now. We did it. We made it out. Kibby's grip tightened on his hand. He had dropped preservation on her a while ago. Was it minutes or hours? When he thought they must surely be out of the chaos. Based on the way the maps had looked. He'd had to do it. To ask her if they'd come far enough. Because Alden couldn't tell anymore. His authority sense was so overwhelmed by the sensation of the machine the system had given him cracking and cracking, that he didn't even have the bandwidth to feel the chaos if it was there. Kibby said it wasn't. She said they were safe here. He reasserted the skill. It cracked. He reasserted it. He raged against it accidentally. It cracked. He reasserted it. Kibby made sure to keep the Oriat around her wrist pressed against his skin. She'd borrowed it from him as they approached. To keep it safe. That's right. We aren't sure what they'll think if they find out it's mine. She's making sure they don't take it away from me. Alden was glad one of them had remembered. She was talking quickly to the people in the room. Answering questions. The parrot person's hands were cold on Alden's chest. They asked everyone something in an anxious tone. Alden's brain deciphered it for him slowly. I have never encountered this species. Without a contract assisting, it's a little difficult to know what I should. Can someone bring me a... He's a human. Kibby sounded offended on Alden's behalf. He's the best human. He is the best avowed in the universe. It's okay, Kibby. I can't even remember what the parrot people are called, so we're even. Something shrieked. And Khoi translation and Artonian followed. Sophie? No. He'd seen the Gryvik when they entered. It was twice Sophie's size. No, he's not the best avowed, Kra. A woman's voice shouted. He's a Riabi single quotee child. That's the pregnant lady from the party. Stuart's aunt. She's not pregnant anymore. And she sounds pissed off. A man in wizard's garb leaned over Alden to pass the parrot person a tablet. The device was speaking rapidly in a language he didn't recognize. The healer set it beside his head and placed their hands back on his chest, looking from him to the screen and back again with bright yellow eyes. Ariabi single quotee, greater than the Gryvik said in a tone Alden recognized as pleased from his experience with Sophie. Like me. Greater than. Not like you, Alisart single quote snapped. He's exponentially weaker than you. He does parties. He is not supposed to be here. Nobody is supposed to be here. What if I had crushed them both when I was, the moon? I think I understand his body well enough to get started at least, the parrot person announced. Someone carry him to the medical room, please. I need to stay with him. Kibby said, smashing her hand on the Oriat with it against his. He needs me. She needs healing, too. But him first. Young Kibby, you cannot keep holding his hand. Alden tried to tell Kibby it was okay. She could let go of him for a second. He wasn't going to fall apart without the Oriat. Maybe. But when he tried to speak, the words were such a croak he couldn't even make them out himself. Kibby almost had butted the healer in an effort to stare into his eyes. Take my Oriat, she said loudly, looping it back around his neck. It will keep you safe while you are being healed. Someone made a slightly pained sound, one of the other Artonians most likely, but nobody objected. Kibby's so cool, Alden thought. She's the coolest person I've ever met. His authority cracked inside the confines of the skill. He tried to reassert. It cracked more. He managed to realign it. I think if they knock me out to heal me, I might die. He wasn't scared at all. He wondered why. Slender arms lifted him easily. It was Alisart's single quotage. Stuart's aunt bit her lower lip and narrowed her eyes at Alden. Low rank, she muttered so quietly he almost didn't catch the words. Her face was tight. Stuck here for months. Skill active for days. I think maybe I should look at. An authority so massive it dwarfed understanding pressed against Alden's own. It wasn't trying to hurt him, but it was too much. If he had possessed the strength to do anything but shore himself up, he would have pushed back against it reflexively. As it was, his own power simply lay quiescent, enduring the examination. After it was over, the other presence backed off. But not completely. Alden still felt an odd pressure and stillness around him. It seemed to help with the cracking. A little. Alisart's single quotage's face was dark as she looked down at him, and then her expression cleared. She smiled over her shoulder. Probably at Kibby. Don't worry, she said. Your friend will be fine after some healing and rest. Oh, wow, thought Alden. That was 100% a loving lie. You really could learn a lot about Artonans by watching their children's shows. Chapter 57. When Alden woke from his initial healing session, he hurt like hell. Roro had knocked him out with a spell while she worked on him. It was her main magical pain relief method, but she couldn't safely keep him under indefinitely. And whatever overkill mind-altering drug Leaf Song had given him had finally worn off at that point. Very apologetic, the Ikorlax gave him something that worked about as well as an aspirin and explained that some of the wizards were trying to track down and/or brew serious, human-approved meds. Being healed was a process. She'd knock him out again soon. Until then, Alden got to feel all of the damage. Stress fractures, broken ankle, broken toes, swollen knees, torn muscles, missing skin, missing nails, giant oozing sores on his ribs and back. He'd been in bad shape before he took the magic pill. Being desperate and unable to register pain had kept him going long after nature would have made him lie down, but it had also let him demolish himself. Roro explained that she had used their first healing bout to deal with the strain on his heart, his dehydration, and his dust-abraded eyes and lungs. All great choices, in Alden's opinion. But even though he understood, it was still disturbing to see himself looking like an infected, broken, and partially skinned monster. The healer left to rest for a couple of hours, came back, and Alden went under again. He woke up completely pain-free and feeling like he had solid-ish bones. The med room was full of way more equipment than it had been when he had first arrived, and he had a couple of hives. Kibby came in shortly after that for what was apparently her own second healing session. She wanted to sit in a chair right beside Alden's bed, and since Roro didn't mind, Alden had a front row seat he was not prepared for while the Ikorlax literally chopped away patches of corruption damage from Kibby's hands and arms and then slowly regrew clean flesh in its place. He tried not to freak out about how awful the process looked. Especially since he was the only one bothered. Kibby had accepted painkillers but refused sedation, and she and Roro were having a relaxed and informative discussion about Artonan biology while the healer worked. Watching the healing did make Alden wonder about how powerful the other avowed was. When Stuart's foot had been blown up, there had been tons of wizard doctors in the operating room at the hospital to patch him up. Admittedly that had been extreme damage to a whole limb, but Roro seemed to be working really fast and without too much strain to fix him and Kibby all by herself. The third time he went under and came back, he woke with fresh skin on his feet and the other places he had needed it in a different set of hives. The new skin was tender, but he was really glad to see it there. All in all, Alden was in and out of consciousness for what he thought was around 6 days. He could have asked for the precise number. It just didn't seem that important. Physically, he went from feeling like he'd been run over by a vicious lawnmower to feeling incredibly well. Every time he thought the healer was done with him, she would reappear and ask for permission to knock him out and improve on something else she had found. Sometimes when he groggily came to, he saw her watching medical lectures on a tablet in her own language. When he asked her about it, she eagerly told him how very exciting it was to deeply explore the cells of a new species. Alden was surprised to learn that the systems often picked up slack when it came to an avowed doing cross-species healing. Roro's skills and spells were something she didn't even have to think about when it came to Artonans or her own kind, since they'd been designed specifically to handle them. And it sounded like she'd enhanced herself with other species-specific healing options as she developed her talents. But she had not anticipated meeting a human. With a new kind of patient in front of her and no direct help from a system, she said she was enjoying the added challenge and artistry of fixing him. On around the 6th day, she started talking about what percentages of his body fat should be stored in various locations, and Alden concluded that he was not being healed back to what had been normal for him pre-Munthegund. Instead, he was being brought to ideal physical health for his age. He assumed Kibby was getting the same treatment. She had been rocketing around the medical room with above-average energy levels lately, and yesterday she'd reported to him that she was growing 30% more hair on top of her head. Alden let Roro do whatever she wanted. She was happy. Kibby was happy. It seemed like the two of them were fast becoming friends. That was good. The Icorlax was smart, and she had a gentleness about her that seemed to permeate the whole room. It was soothing to be in her presence. Kibby needed a friend like that. Line of asterisks. The next time Alden's eyes opened, he was tucked into the most comfortable bed he'd ever slept in. The sheets were silky and exactly the right temperature. The pillow was lightly and pleasantly scented. And something magical was definitely going on with the mattress. No pressure points. He almost felt like he was floating in dense water. It wasn't the medical area. He let his eyes roam around the dimly lit room, taking in the luxurious furnishings, until they landed on the other occupant. Knight Alisart sat behind a pale wooden desk with curved legs. A three-paneled piece of abstract art on the wall behind her was giving off a soft golden glow, and she was writing with a pen in what looked like an oversized journal. Something of a rarity. You hardly ever saw Artonans using paper when they had such ubiquitous access to tech and magic. Kibby wasn't around. Kibby was almost always around. She'd stuck to Alden like glue ever since they arrived. The other day he'd woken up and heard a familiar sound from under his bed in the medical area, and when he'd rolled over to check, he'd seen her curled up there, doing her squeaky snore. No Kibby. Sleeping in the quaternary's own room. So, he thought, it's today. He'd been wondering when Alisart was finally going to talk to him. The knight had only come by to see him a single time so far, and their conversation had been brief and stiff compared to the more playful version of her he remembered from the party. He didn't know what she thought or felt about him. He was sure he knew what she was going to tell him, though, and the stiffness was only to be expected. He considered making a sound to let her know he was awake. Just to get it over with quicker. But he didn't really want it to be over with quicker. It had been fun for the past couple of days. He'd been magically turned into someone ridiculously healthy. He'd met a huge T who'd waxed poetic about his skills in hard surface scoring and multi-species massage therapy. And he'd spent lots of time talking to a Kibby who was happy, relaxed, and unstrained by the chaos. So instead of calling attention to himself, he lay there quietly, enjoying the comfy bed and listening to the pen scratch against the paper. It was the only sound other than his own breathing. His tinnitus was gone. He had asked Roro to take care of it, and she'd been thrilled to have a specific target for her attentions. Especially since he wouldn't let her get rid of the shrapnel scar on his abdomen. Finally Alisart looked up and realized he was watching her. Oh, Alden. She gave him the smile, the same forced one Hannah had given him when she first realized he was awake inside the bubble. You're awake. How are you today? I've never been healthier in my life. Your healer is wonderful. She does have the most stellar qualifications. Though when I asked her if she would come along for this assignment I assumed she wouldn't actually have to do anything. The smile fell. She hitched it back up. She had a very readable face. Or maybe it was just that Alden was comparing her to Joe. I'm happy to tell you that we have a teleportation on board the ship we arrived on. It's not as good as a contract-to-contract teleport, but it's better than nothing. Now that you're well, I'm sure you're excited to get back home. Alden was surprised. He'd thought the lie several days ago had only been for Kibby. It is kind of nice to get one, I guess. If you understand why she's doing it. You don't have to feel bad about it, he said, sitting up in the bed. It's not your fault I'm dying. He wished he could be a little more specific and let her know he actually understood what she had been doing for him ever since he arrived. But it was Joe who told him that this situation could happen, during the conversation covered by the extra absolute secrecy agreement. A scale tips, the professor had said. Kibby had begun to existentially stabilize and recover her authority almost as soon as they set foot in the cleansed zone. Alden had, too. In a way. But he was still falling apart. He wondered if it had even been the chaos rupturing his skill and his trait during that last day of the long journey, or if that had just been an added disaster on top of the one already taking place within him. Now that he was out of the corruption, his power felt so strange. The unbound authority was strong again. It was thrilling, amazing. But it was also like some giant bird that wanted to launch itself to new heights, without any regard for the fact that his affixation was collapsing under the force of it. H had been doing something all this time to keep it in check. She'd been holding her authority over him like a weighted blanket. That and his own efforts to directly repair the damage with his beginner-level control were the only things keeping him from what Joe had once assured him would be an agonizing death or something much worse. The Artonan woman looked stricken. "You knew?" she said, setting aside her pen. "I would have talked to you much sooner if I'd realized." Occasionally, avowed consent said when they're at risk of imbalance and loss of skill assignment. "I wasn't sure about you. I haven't worked with a human closely before, and everyone is different. At first, I thought you might be able to, since you seemed to feel my brother's power at that party, but then you were so calm I decided I must be mistaken. I can feel that something's wrong." An understatement. I'm told it feels like a dread with no source to those without an Artonan sense for it. I'm sorry. That must be awful. Alden blinked. That would be awful. What was happening to him was also awful, but at least it wasn't sourceless, incomprehensible dread. "It's not your fault," he said again. "But I want to talk about it without kind lies. I have questions. What's going to happen to Kibby?" She took a deep breath. "Eventually, she'll be in the care of a cousin on Artoni, her closest relative. However, that will take some time. The entire Monthagund contract collapsed. We'll be, an entirely new one. At that point, it will be safe for everyone to teleport in and out again. And, for the people who reside here. Something that will vastly improve the quality of their lives. But it will be several more months. She wants to learn magic. And I think meeting a knight was one of her goals, but I guess we've done that." H gave him the first real smile he'd seen on her face since he arrived. "The two of you are best friends with my brother, I believe." Alden snorted. "It's even funnier if you know how difficult he's to make friends with. To answer your worry, the girl will be safe and well. Either here with us or with a family until she can join her relative." She paused. "She is very proper around me now that she is sure I am taking good care of you. I doubt she will ask me for anything at all herself. If you tell me what she wants, I will get it for her." Alden had a long mental list of all the things Kibby needed, wanted, and deserved. And he didn't hesitate for a second in asking the knight for every single one of them. Rather than becoming annoyed by the number of requests, H seemed relieved that he had them. If Kibby didn't have some objection, she would be living here in the travel dome for the next several months, having magic lessons with some very talented wizards and spending lots of time with Roro. They would help her get in touch with instructor Gwenlor, and they would arrange for her future attendance at the elementary boarding school if her cousin didn't refuse. H said she couldn't imagine why the cousin would. Sending a child off to wizard school was an achievement for most people. She would also be able to talk to Joe and the people who had been rescued from the lab. That was the only request the knight balked at. "I have noticed her affection for Whirly Roden," she said in a frosty tone while she sipped on a cup of tea. Roro had brought first meal and an extra chair for Alden a while ago. He sat at the desk across from Alisart working his way through 2 giant plates of food. Healing made you feel like you were starving. His stomach had been a bottomless pit all week. And the Icorlax was completely charmed by his diet anyway. She seemed to think it was a pacifistic choice on his part. Alden forced himself to swallow instead of talking with his mouth full. Rodan is really generous to his assistants. Kibby had assured Alden Joe was the guy to work for if you were a scientist interested in chaos and demonic energies. It was a field of study often limited to the wizard class, but Joe apparently didn't enjoy working with other wizards. Someone who treats their own species well while behaving as if a member of another one is a disposable tool is not a good role model, maybe. The knight used more unfamiliar words than Kibby did. He guessed he'd just gotten used to his roommate's vocabulary. When what Alisart had said finally registered, Alden's eyes widened. Oh, she's really mad I'm here, he realized. He had definitely gotten angry vibes from the Quaternary right from the moment he walked into her dome and collapsed in front of her. But he hadn't been sure if she was inconvenienced by the presence of 2 dirty injured people, upset she'd almost crushed Kibby in what appeared to be an intense magical terraforming project, or just upset in general that something unexpected had happened and she'd been ill-informed. Rodan did tell me it was dangerous to pick berries on Munthagund, he said. It was kind of funny to Alden that he had to keep talking about berries with someone who knew for a fact that he'd been sent here to rescue Joe's assistants. During his first round of medical treatment, Kibby had described him as Saint Alden, the savior of the lab, to everyone in the dome. After all, she didn't have any contract tattoos preventing her from telling people the full story. She'd even embellished it a little in his favor before she had realized that Roro was going to take good care of him regardless of whether or not he deserved it. Nobody forced me to come here, Alden added. The knight's expression was unyielding. I am sure he told you everything you needed to know before you agreed and that he had your best interests at the front of his mind, she said caustically, slamming her cup down. Alden jumped. He was certain the cup would have shattered if it hadn't been made of wood. I am sure he did not throw an ignorant young teenager at a problem of his own making like a dash. She's gonna kill Joe? I'm all right, he said hastily. You're literally moments away from dying horribly. Alden dropped his fork. He didn't mean to. His fingers just let go without his permission. He winced. Alisart face paled. Said Alden. I meant I'm all right. Emotionally? It wasn't untrue. He didn't know why he was okay with the situation, but he was. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that he'd been sure on some level, for a very long time, that he was going to die here on Munthagund. He wanted to go home so badly, but it had been ages since he really believed himself when he imagined doing it. Probably that's the opposite of being alright emotionally, he thought. But it didn't change the fact that he somehow felt like he'd won just by making it here. The silence that fell in the room was awkward. Might as well lean into it. Some moments away from death? How many moments? Should I eat faster? He tried for a smile. Alisart just sat there staring at him. Kibby says my jokes are bad. She pushed her plate away from her and sighed. Not bad. I enjoy humor usually. But it's depressing coming from an avowed in your situation. I will remove my protection from you this afternoon. I am not skilled enough to fix what is wrong with you. I would be prolonging things pointlessly if I tried, and I would risk you. There are very few people who might be able to help, and the true planets cannot, any of them. They are all assigned elsewhere. I did look into it. Ah. Okay, thought Alden, staring at a small round fruit that looked like a candied apricot. It's this afternoon. The fact that you survived for this long in even a low-level corruption environment at your age and rank shows natural talent, the knight said. The same talent my brother detected in you, I believe. But it is not enough to earn you extraordinary help. I am truly sorry. It was already good of you to stop cleaning up the moon so that you could take care of me. Alden assumed that was why he hadn't gotten to experience the daily dirt-smashing phenomenon up close since he arrived. Alisart had stopped working as soon as he got here. "Do not thank me," she said, looking away from him to stare at a mirrored dressing table. "My kindness is... The best thing I could do for you would be to ignore my task here, maintain my, and your presence, and travel with you back to Ortona, where the contract can probably save you. We might make it." She still wasn't looking at him. "But that would take months. Delaying the cleansing of the corruption and the creation of a contract here, one stable enough to allow all citizens to teleport and receive aid from the rest of the universe, would cost lives. Probably too many to be, by your own future potential." Alden wondered if he should have specified that he would prefer to have something between the loving lie and total honesty. It did hurt to know there were salvation methods that wouldn't be used. "The only recourse left to you is the emergency teleportation option on our ship," Alisart continued. "It would not be safe for someone as weak as you even under normal circumstances. In your situation, even with the mother planet as an ideal and relatively close destination, I do not think you will survive the trip." Alden looked up from his plate. "There really is a teleporter?" She finally turned back to him. "Yes? Did you think I made it up? I thought you were just trying to make me feel better." "I was. It's a bad option. But it does exist." Alden felt something stir inside him. He hoped it wasn't hope. That seemed like a very dangerous emotion at a time like this. "And the contract on Ortona can help me?" Crap. It was definitely hope. He tried to crush it back down, but he felt his heart rate pick up. It's ideal for Avowed to return to their home contract for skill assignment. Especially in situations like this. But the mother planet is the second best choice. "That sounds like a good plan then," Alden said, wondering if he looked excited. He hoped he didn't look excited. It was entirely the wrong thing at this moment. "You were probably going to die, stupid. You were fine with it 10 seconds ago. Focus on the stuff you need to get done." "What was that stuff again?" "Kibby would be fine." "Oh. Yes. Can't I make some kind of a legal request saying who gets my possessions if I die?" He didn't know if Ortonans did wills. The system actually had options for listing your beneficiaries, but Alden hadn't had the time or the inclination to set that kind of thing up. "I got summoned a couple of hours after I agreed to the contract, and then I was busy. So I never thought about it seriously." Alisart closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, her facial expression had smoothed into something more neutral. "I can be the dash for any sort of contract, magical or legal, you wish to make," she said. "Naturally I will see to it that your requests are honored." "Great," thought Alden. "Kibby and Bo can have their share of my gold all at once. But Aunt Connie should probably receive inheritance money in installments. Jeremy could have Alden's non-monetary stuff. His parents were rich, and he was the kind of person who got nostalgic over mementos." Chapter 58 Saying goodbye to Kibby sucked. Alden asked himself what he would want for the two of them in an absolutely perfect universe, and the answer was that he'd like for them to live together in a peaceful chaos-free cottage on Earth, with a kidnapped instructor Gwenlore on the premises to teach them magic every day and nothing but endless amounts of free time. He told Kibby this while they took a long walk together across the bare, chaos-free soil of Munthagund, leaving the dome far behind. It was almost completely private. He could still feel Alisart. But she must not have been able to hear his words or his thoughts, or she'd have had a much better understanding of him than she actually did. "We would have to be excellent students if we kidnapped her, Alden," Kibby said. "It would add a lot of pressure." "We can handle pressure." "Yes," Kibby agreed. "Will you send me a message as soon as you get back to Earth?" Alden's large breakfast was heavy in his stomach. "It might take me a while to settle in and get used to home and the contract again," he said finally. "Give me a few human weeks, and then I'll send you messages through night Alisart and pester you every day." If she wasn't expecting him to reach out for a while, she could relax into life here before she realized something bad had happened. She could be a child. She could grow close to Roro and the wizards. She could have some cushion against the news. "You have to hide the Orient under your flower shirt before we get back," Kibby reminded him. Alden realized he'd been rubbing it again and tucked it away. His wardrobe had been reduced to a clean but abused-looking Hawaiian shirt and some loaned wizard pants so short they landed just below his knees. He didn't even have a pair of shoes. He'd been going barefoot everywhere. He buttoned the top button on the shirt. "Hidden?" he asked. She nodded. "I don't think Knight Alisart H would care that it's yours. Do you want to tell her?" "I don't mind. You said maybe it would be dangerous once." "I don't know that people will be upset. I'm just not sure." "Then we shouldn't say anything," Kibby said. "I like keeping secrets with you anyway." Alden smiled. "I like it, too. You know what I don't like?" "What?" "The fact that you're going to get so far ahead of me now that you're learning magic from wizards who were chosen to be companions for a night." "It's true," Kibby said, grinning up at him. "I will exceed you in every way. Even if I'm the best avowed in the universe? You will be the best avowed. I will be the next primary." "Wow. You're killing your hero just like that? So much ambition. He doesn't have to die. He just has to become secondary instead." "I'm excited." Alden reached for her hand as they turned back to the dome. "I'm going to have matching face tattoos with the primary one day." Line of asterisks. Alden got to ride in a spaceship. To a bigger spaceship. It was something so far outside his imagination that it had never even made it onto his bucket list. The small egg-shaped transport vessel that ferried them from the ground to the ship in orbit had giant windows. Alisart H was the only other passenger, and she quickly realized that Alden wasn't paying attention to her at all as they rose swiftly but gently through thick yellow-gray clouds, and he finally saw what had been beyond them all this time. Below him, there was the curve of the moon's atmosphere as it fell away. And there was Kimner, an aqua and green gas giant with striations like Jupiter's, set against a field of black. "God," he said in English. "It's beautiful." He pressed a hand to the window. He felt very small. There was a lot of time to stare, but it still wasn't enough. When they docked with a larger ship, he tried not to be disappointed that their trip through the narrow white corridors did not take them past any viewing areas. There were a lot of wizards on board. Most of them stood out of the way and made respectful gestures to the knight as she passed. Someone ran up with a tablet to ask a question about a technical matter and got a look that made even Alden, in the strange mood he was in, feel vicarious mortification. "That guy is probably going to go back to his cabin and cry," he thought, as he watched the wizard jog down the corridor. They arrived at the teleportation chamber quickly. For some reason, Alden wasn't prepared for that. He knew he should have been. The ship was large, but it was still only a ship. Just because he was walking to what was probably his death, it didn't mean the trip would get longer out of respect. The circular door cracked in an odd asymmetrical pattern at their approach and drew back into the walls in segments. Alisart strode into the room. "Get out," she said to the 5 other Artonans assembled there. "I can finish powering it up myself." The wizard scurried away from her and past Alden without glancing back. He just stood there on the threshold, staring. It didn't look anything like a teleportation alcove or the summonarium. The floor was covered in gray sand. The ceiling was hidden by an impenetrable darkness. Large rocks and chunks of what looked like driftwood were arranged in patterns that almost made sense. But not quite. All of the light came from a line of flames a foot wide that spiraled across the walls. The air smelled like blood. Alden didn't know how long he stood at the threshold, watching Alisart touch various objects one by one and murmur over them. But he was sure it was too long. His chest felt tight. He couldn't quite control his breathing. The knight never told him to hurry up and step inside the room. Eventually, he did it anyway. The sand was soft under his bare feet. "Do I stand in the center?" "You can stand wherever you like," she said in the same steady voice she had been using with him for hours. "The entire room is the focus of the spell." Alden stood in the center anyway. It just seemed like the thing to do. He looked down at his hands and realized they were trembling, so he stuffed them into the pockets of his borrowed pants. Artonans are really great about pockets. They put tons of them on absolutely everything. Probably because they were always carrying so much magic junk. His left hand found the ball of putty he'd been hauling around for months, and he squeezed it. He wondered what Alice would think if she knew he was holding onto one of her nephew's bones. He had started to throw it away after the experiment with Kibby's blood. Gorgon had asked him not to do the right again, and he couldn't even fathom a situation in which he would want to intimately connect with Stuart's mind and soul in order to be some kind of gremlin-directed, authority-wasting wishing well. But keeping it together had been pretty hard lately, and Alden had learned to value any little thing that made him smile. There was definitely something funny about being a rabbit carrying around the lucky wizard's foot. Macabre. But funny. Is there anything? Alice hesitated, then seemed to change her mind about what she wanted to say. I will step out of the room. You will remain under my protection until the last possible moment. The teleportation spell will, you toward Artoni, and the contract will take over once you arrive. If it works, Alden said. Yes. He dug his toes into the sand. That sounds good. Thank you for your help. Yes. Of course. She turned to go. Alden felt an urge to ask her to wait. He swallowed hard and ignored it. She'd already agreed to do everything he really cared about. He didn't have anything else to say. He just didn't want to be alone. Alice crossed the few paces to the door and stopped there for a moment, then she suddenly spun back around and returned to join him in the center of the room. Maybe she can read minds, after all, Alden thought. She cleared her throat and looked up at him. Before you go, let me give you a message to deliver. He didn't know what she meant. He was startled when she lifted her arms to cup his cheeks in both hands. She stared at him for a moment, searching his face like she was memorizing it, then she met his gaze. Mother, she said clearly, if this one makes it to you, place both of your eyes upon him. He has done more for us than he had to. She let go of Alden's face, gave him a stiff nod, and left. The strange door shut behind her. He stood there for several seconds with nothing but the flickering shadows of the things in the room for company. Fists clenched, heart pounding, he tried one last time to control his own raging authority, to reassert the existence of the skill. To do anything and everything he could before it happened. The saving blanket of Alice authority vanished suddenly. Alden slammed his eyes shut. He felt pure terror. And pain. Then, he didn't feel anything at all. Ritual of return detected. Ritual legally authorized by law Alice Contract I attempting to establish connection to spell and preserve Hecate. Attempting to establish connection to spell and preserve Hecate. Connection to spell established. Hecate of passenger is damaged. Priority of passenger is low. Likelihood of passenger survival is low. Chance of significant fallout upon arrival is 4.28%. Cost of salvation exceeds thresholds. Risk exceeds thresholds. Destruction of ritual of return will commence in 0.00 turn. Final analysis prior to destruction underway. Analysis completed. Personal request from low Alice detected. Modifying records. Awaiting decision from mother. Decision made. Passenger reprioritized. Contract I realigning resources to support ritual of return. Rerouting destination in case of fallout. Attempting to repair passenger Hecate. Told continued. Thanks for listening.